I'm here to speak about climate change and community safety and how the lessons that we're learning from the COVID-19 pandemic should really be used to guide the response to the looming climate crisis. I'll also share with you a project I co-led with Dr. Viessmann, who's the executive director of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. And this project was done in partnership with Wilfrid Laurier's University's Viessmann Center for Engagement and Research in Sustainability. So to get started today, I'll provide a little bit of a context of the issue of climate change and crime and violence. As many of you community safety practitioners know, and probably have been grappling with over the past year or more, COVID-19 has threatened the safety of people in many communities. We've heard or read reports of various crime and violence directly related to the measures that have been implemented to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. For instance, we've read reports of domestic violence during lockdown at vaccination clinics, as well as some of the other examples that you would see here on the screen. But as I'm sure you're aware from your own work and your own experiences, these reports are neither new nor are they unfamiliar. Yet, we in the communities that we represent still struggle with the responses to this pandemic. What COVID has done, it has reminded us of the many people experiencing higher levels of vulnerabilities to crime and violence. And as we consider these tragic outcomes, the question that one may pose is, what could have been done to prevent these consequences? We must also deal with the knowledge that in a world of rapid global movement, people aren't the only things that are moving. Viruses and diseases travel just as well, which means that it's highly likely in the coming future that we can see another event like COVID-19. Perhaps it's because COVID is still ongoing, or maybe because of the abruptness with which it occurred, that we might tend to consider it an unprecedented event. And perhaps it is on a global scale, at least within our lifetime. However, on a local scale, there are examples of disasters, if you cast your mind back to Hurricane Katrina, for instance, that have brought about community safety challenges with crime and violence outcomes that have seriously affected our communities. I want to share with you this excerpt from a podcast created by our team. And as I read this excerpt, I want you to think about if this sounds familiar. So, in the summer of 1995, a heat wave struck Chicago. A heat wave so hot that it warped train rails and it caused roads to buckle. The heat wave caught both residents and city workers off guard. Hospital and emergency crews were quickly overrun and patches of the power grid failed. By the time it was over, approximately 739 people had lost their lives. And who might these people have been? Sadly, many of the people who died were elderly people who lived alone. They actually chose to stay indoors because the sense of danger on the outside and the fear of leaving their possessions unattended was actually greater than the fear of this heat itself, which makes this a community safety issue. But that wasn't the only community safety issue that was at play. Young residents who lived in communities with very few public spaces that had access to air conditioning, in their desperation to keep cool, they opened more than 3,000 fire hydrants around the city. This actually caused a drop in water pressure, which caused water outages to buildings in the surrounding areas. Imagine, if you will, what the safety repercussions of that would have been had there been a fire outbreak within those communities. Now, to stop them from using the hydrants, the city announced that anyone found tampering with the hydrants would be arrested, effectively criminalizing people who lived in poverty or lived at a socioeconomic status simply because they had no other options to cool down during this dangerous heat wave. And because of this, anger erupted, which eventually led to street violence. And when the emergency crews were dispatched to seal the hydrants, they were met with resistance out of desperation as people threw bricks and rocks to keep them away. When Eric Klingenberg reflects on this occurrence, he refers to the Chicago heat wave as a social disaster. But what does this tell us? Well, just like COVID-19, This story highlights the consequences of poor disaster planning and the impact that it can have on violence, crime, and community safety. But in addition to Eric Klingenberg, there are a few other people who've been thinking about these connections within the context of climate change. And one of those is Robert Muga, who has thought and written about these connections with us from a security perspective. Now, a few years ago, Robert and Felix Munger had a conversation, essentially asking who else is looking into this potential connection between climate change and community safety, and what is needed. And this conversation eventually led to the idea for an exploratory project titled Mapping the Intersection of Climate Change and Community Safety, which was eventually funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and conducted in partnership between VERiS Institute and the NCP. Now, for this project, we actually brought together over 30 participants from community organizations who represent population groups that experience higher levels of vulnerability or inequality, such as elderly populations, women, indigenous populations. Along with those, we brought together some academics, some safety and security experts, as well as climate change and disaster management practitioners to discuss this issue. And what we really did is we set out to investigate the potential connections between climate change hazards and public safety outcomes at the local and municipal, within the local and municipal context, bearing in mind that more attention has been paid to these potential connections from an international and national security perspective as it relates to climate change. But what we wanted to do is map climate hazards, for instance, coastal flooding, heat waves, droughts, etc., and vulnerabilities with safety outcomes at the local level, thinking about what connections are more likely to occur or what connections are of greater concern. And importantly, we wanted to provide a forum for interdisciplinary stakeholder and expert collaboration to bring greater attention to this challenge. So we actually identified several possible connections during this project, but we also realized that the connection between climate change hazards, for instance, flooding or wildfires, and outcomes like increased property crimes or domestic violence, that those connections are actually quite complex, and there's quite a bit of overlap between the various kinds of hazards and the various outcomes that we mapped for the workshop. And I'll give you two examples of what we found. The first one is this. Climate change may actually increase social conflict, leading to discrimination, things like discrimination, scapegoating, increased racial tensions, hate crimes, property crimes, or fraudulent crimes. For instance, marginalized groups like Black, Indigenous people of color, or LGBTQ youth, for instance, they face increased exposure to violence and criminalization during and in the aftermath of disasters. During Hurricane Katrina, for instance, there was actually a report from two paramedics about a group of mostly Black residents who attempted to cross a bridge into what would be considered a better off community in search of safety after being told that all the shelters within their city were at capacity. And as they approached the bridge to go into this community, they were met by a group of sheriffs who actually fired shots above their head to keep them back away from the bridge. Now, later when asked about this occurrence, the police commissioner actually admitted that it had happened, but he offered the reason that this had happened was that the town that these residents were trying to access, it didn't have enough resources to support the refugees. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this report and the response, but I give this example to highlight how poor and usually racialized communities are left with limited choices due to economic constraints and lack of support, and how this lack of choices actually places them in situations where they're exposed to violence in their pursuit of safety and security. I'll share another quick example for you. And this is about how climate change will actually create the conditions and the opportunities for crime. Now, if you have damaged infrastructure from some kind of natural extreme weather event, that damaged transportation and social infrastructure can actually isolate elders and other vulnerable groups like women and children, as you have seen with COVID as well. And what this does is the decreased access to socialization opportunities actually creates those environments where the type of violence that we're concerned about, elder abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse, where these types of violence may go unnoticed against these vulnerable populations. Out of the exploratory study, we came up with a number of recommendations. The first recommendation is that there's insufficient research and therefore we need to do more. However, I won't go into that today. The second set of recommendations that I actually want to focus on are actually around practice. And right now, there's no single place that a practitioner, be that a climate change or community safety practitioner, there's no single place that they can go to learn more about these connections. And therefore, we're recommending the creation of a repository, some kind of place for anyone who's interested in this topic, in this challenge, that they can go to read and learn more about the links that we started to discuss during our project. We also recommend the creation of a conceptual framework to show how these links, to show the connection between these various factors that might increase safety outcomes because of climate change. The other thing was, it also came to light how siloed climate change and community safety planning actually is. Climate change practitioners doing vulnerability and adaptation planning, they tend to focus on threats to infrastructure and healthcare systems or vulnerable economic sectors, but they don't look at threats to community safety, particularly when we think about the potential for increases in violence and crime. And similarly, those doing community planning, community safety plans, they tend not to think about climate change risks. And what we're therefore saying is that we need to remove these silos and bring these groups together, because there's quite a significant area of overlap in terms of the vulnerability that make populations predisposed for various negative outcomes. And equally as important is the need for an equity lens. We need to keep at the forefront of all planning the importance of paying attention to existing vulnerabilities. And just like COVID-19, those with existing increased vulnerabilities are the ones at increased risk of experiencing negative outcomes. But, rather, despite mitigation efforts, we know climate change is here to stay. And as community safety practitioners, as elected officials, as government staff, we ought to expect similar events in the future, be that more pandemics and more disasters from extreme weather events, directly related to the changes that we're seeing in our climate. And if the evidence is right, Canada will see more wildfires, they'll see more heat events, more flooding, and more supply chain disruptions. And COVID-19 has given us insight into how extreme weather events can and will play out if we aren't properly prepared. Unfortunately, some of the COVID-19 responses place people in unsafe situations, like women during stay-at-home orders, or people in poverty with low-paying jobs that had no choice but to go to work. And therefore, we need to better anticipate these eventualities with the other hazards and with other disasters so that we're not caught off guard again. Because if we don't, the same people will be left behind. And to that end, community safety practitioners need to prepare with a stronger equity lens. As we reflect on COVID-19, data coming out of Toronto reinforces the disproportionate impacts on racialized communities from hazards. And what this means is that community safety practitioners and climate change practitioners need to identify the population groups that will experience higher levels of vulnerability because of existing inequalities that are linked to discriminatory social structures, so that they can create solutions that are responsive to the unique needs of these populations. If our communities are prepared to act, then when these events do occur, and they will, we can respond and recover quicker with less severe consequences for our communities. Finally, we don't want to reinvent the wheels. By that, I mean there are tools out there that can simply be expanded to use to prepare for these eventualities. And I'm referring to the vulnerability and adaptation assessments used by climate change practitioners and the community safety plans used by community safety practitioners. As I conclude today, if there's one key message that I would want you to take away from this presentation, it is this. Communities need to be better prepared for various types of hazards, like those associated with climate change, from a safety perspective to avoid disastrous outcomes. And this planning should have a strong equity lens to ensure that the people who bear the brunt of these consequences are better prepared than we've done in the past. Thank you.